Drugs exist throughout nature, and their use to produce intoxication occurs in animals far older than man. It seems that as long as blood has flowed through human veins, drugs have flowed with it. And wherever you find the phenomenon of intoxication, so too will you find the problem of addiction. Of all the questions we can ask about addiction, there is one question that stands out. All the other questions about addiction begin with this one, and everything hinges on the answer. The most important question about addiction is simply this: is it really a disease? When I first came to treatment for my own problem with addiction, my counselors told me that addiction was a disease. As a physician, I was skeptical. Addiction's not a disease, it's a choice. Diabetes is a disease. The diabetic didn't choose to get it, but the drug addict did have the choice to start using drugs. Cancer is a disease. It befalls an unfortunate person through no fault of their own. But addicts, they do this to themselves. That made sense to me. But the more I expressed my sympathy for the argument against calling addiction a disease, the more my counselors told me that I was in denial and that I needed to surrender. Well, they were right, I did. But as a doctor, I believe that patients have the right to ask questions. And as a patient, I wasn't satisfied with the answers I was getting. A lot of people told me that addiction was a disease, but very few of them could defend that position. And I had to know. So I decided to find out for myself. And that set me on a personal journey that has taken the last 10 years of my life. Along the way, I've come to realize that this question is far more complex than it looks. And finding the answer takes more than medicine and science. Our path travels through philosophy, law, politics, even history. I began my search just trying to make sense of my own addictive behavior. I quickly discovered that I had stumbled across one of the greatest intellectual puzzles of our time. There are many arguments against calling addiction a disease, but the best argument I've ever heard is one I call the choice argument. The choice argument says that addiction can't be a disease because drug taking is a behavior and all behaviors are choices. The choice argument goes on to say that even though an addict might tell you he can't stop drinking or using drugs, that he's powerless over drugs and alcohol, really he can stop anytime. That's right, addicts can quit anytime they want. You just have to help them make the right choice. To show how easy it is to get an addict to stop drinking or using drugs, the choice argument suggests this simple experiment. I take a bottle of alcohol, pour out a glass, and put it in front of the alcoholic. And I offer it up to him. Go ahead, Mr. Alcoholic, take a drink. No, really, it's on the house. But when the alcoholic reaches for the glass, I add a small twist. Oh, but Mr. Alcoholic, if you do choose to take that drink, then I'm going to blow your brains out. Most alcoholics will choose not to drink. And that's the choice argument's point. With a strong enough threat, I can get the addict to stop their behavior in a way I just can't for real patients with real diseases. Diabetes, for instance. You can't put a gun to the head of the diabetic and say, okay, better bring that blood sugar down to 100 or I'll blow your brains out. It's not going to work. The choice argument draws a distinction between behaviors and symptoms. In the case of symptoms, those are part of a disease process. Free will plays no part. We don't hold patients responsible for their symptoms because they can't choose not to have them, and that's why punishing and coercing real patients is inappropriate. But drug taking is a behavior. All behaviors are choices. Free will does exist. The addict is responsible for their behaviors because they can quit if they choose to. You just have to motivate them to make the right choice. That's the choice argument. That's the best argument I've ever heard against calling addiction a disease. And I think it's a darn good argument. But it has problems. And in the end, I think the choice argument is wrong because it fails to take into account some exciting new research about the brain. Research that shows that our capacity for choice is far more complicated and fragile than we ever imagined. Is addiction a disease or a choice? The short answer is addiction is a disease of choice. It's a disorder of the very parts of the brain we need to make proper decisions. Our modern concept of disease, what doctors call the disease model, is only about 100 years old. It emerged from germ theory, from the work of early microbiologists such as Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. The disease model says that you've got an organ, it gets a defect, and as a result you see symptoms. It doesn't matter what the organ is, bone, liver, kidney, whatever. The defect is a physical cellular defect. Cells die, cancer develops, an infection perhaps, and if a person has that defect in that organ, they will show certain signs and symptoms. That might not look like much, but that is actually everything that doctors do. And what is this model? It's a causal model. I'll show you how it works. Let's say you go skiing. You ski too fast and hit a tree. You might get a defect, a fracture, in an organ, your femur. If so, you will show the symptoms of a broken leg. The disease model tells the doctor where to go. After the symptoms, no, doctors do not chase symptoms. They fix the defect, and with time and healing, the symptoms go away. That's an illness that doctors can cure. Let's look at one that they can only treat. This is diabetes. This time the organ is the pancreas. The defect is the death of cells that produce insulin, and every one of the symptoms of diabetes can be traced back to that defect in that organ. Before doctors had the disease model, they tried to chase down and fix each individual symptom, and it didn't work. Most diabetics died in childhood. But once doctors started using the disease model, it told them exactly what to do. You simply replace the insulin, and if you do it correctly, the symptoms of diabetes disappear. The disease model rescued medicine from all those bad explanations of disease, morals, personality, race, gender, and it was so powerful a model at revealing the true cause of illness that it changed the world. The disease model doubled the human lifespan in only 100 years. And 100 years ago, doctors knew that. They knew that this new, modern, scientific definition of disease would make the new, modern, scientific profession of medicine powerful too. But they also realized that they had to figure out, right away, what was a disease and what wasn't. Who would be a patient and who would medicine wash its hands of? It was easy to see how broken legs and diabetes fit the disease model. So doctors ruled that these were diseases, and the people who had them were patients. But how did addiction fit the disease model? What was the organ? Was it the brain? Was it the liver? What was the nature of the defect? 100 years ago, no one knew these things. And the symptoms of addiction, well, they just looked like badness. When doctors could not readily fit addiction to the disease model, they declared that it was no longer a disease, and that addicts were no longer patients. That didn't mean that addiction just disappeared. It meant that another group in our society had to handle addiction. And that group is the criminal justice system. As a result of that decision made by doctors almost 100 years ago, today in the United States we have 2.3 million people in prison. And most of those people are there for one thing: drugs or alcohol, or the things that people do on drugs and alcohol. When you get into numbers like 2.3 million people, this isn't a criminal justice problem anymore. This is a public health catastrophe. If we knew the organ involved in addiction, if we understood the defect, and if that defect in that organ explained addictive behaviors, unpleasant as they are, then addiction would fit the disease model, and all of this would end. For nearly 100 years, medicine has been unable to do that, and the problem of addiction has fallen largely to the law. Until today. In the last 20 years, there has been an explosion of understanding about the brain and addiction. Today, neuroscientists do know the parts of the brain involved in addiction. They know the nature of the defect, and that defect in that organ shows that the behaviors of addicts are in fact symptoms of a disease.